Make sure I'm turned on. There we go. Got it. Good evening. My name is Pat Benham, and I am a longtime parishioner here at St. Odelia and also a member of our Respect Life Committee. I'd like to start our evening tonight with Father James giving us an opening prayer.
Thank you very much, Pat, and all who are here, and for our speaker for making the trip here to Minnesota, and for everyone joining us virtually as well. We'll begin our time in prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks and praise for the great gift of life. We thank you for your mercy and your strength in the challenges of life. We pray in a particular way for our brothers and sisters, those who are struggling with infertility, that you would bless them, if it is your will, with the gift of a child. May you watch over and bless all of the children of our world, that those who are without homes would be received warmly. May you watch over and bless us this evening with the grace of your Son, Jesus, and the outpouring of your Holy Spirit. We entrust this time, too, to the intercession of our Blessed Mother and pray, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.
I wanted to say a couple of things before I introduce our speaker. The format tonight will be that Leah will speak for approximately an hour, and then we will allow a lot of time for questions and answers also. And there are note cards right over there on that little table. You can fill out note cards and put them in there anytime during the talk. In addition to that, if you want to ask a question, we will also have a mic that you can line up and ask questions there as well. So I also wanted to say that in the rear of the church, we have a resource table there. And there are quite a few interesting things. One of them is Leah's new book, which will be available for sale, and it's called The Dignity of Dependence. And so that will be there, and you are free to purchase a book there if you would like to. I read the book, and I think I told you I read half of it out loud to my husband. There's so much good information in there. Another thing is that we have lots of handouts and also I put together a resource list of articles that are related to IVF or infertility and also the church's teachings. Most of the articles on here are like from 2024, 2025, so they're really current articles. I also have a booklet back there if you wanted to browse through and see some of them. And then you can also pick up one of these sheets. And also, let's see, there's those things, and then also we're lucky to have two women in the back that will help us with some other information. One of them is Laura Elm, and Laura Elm is here, and she is the person who started a program called Sacred Heart Guardians. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but it's an organization that facilitates Christian burials for embryos who have died in IVF labs. And Laura is the founder, and she will also be at the back table to answer some questions. Another person who's back there is Karen Rose, and Karen is the founder of a group called InspireCare, and they provide, she has brochures back there also, and we'll talk to you, holistic suggestions or helps to go along with answering infertility issues. We also have some articles back there on NAPRO, which is another reproductive help for people who are facing infertility. There's also a little free will offering basket if you'd like to contribute and help us with expenses or for any future events. Let me see if I got everything here. Yep, I think that's everything. So without ado, let me say I'm very, very pleased to welcome Leah Sargent. She is a well-known and well-respected author of 3 books. As I said, her most recent book, just hot off the press, literally. She's on a book tour for this last month or so. Has been on lots of different podcasts and lots of tours around the United States talking about her book. So we're lucky for her to be able to squeeze this into her schedule here. So We appreciate that. But Leah is also works in Washington, D.C. in the role of focusing on family policy. Her writings have been featured in many, many different publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Lamp, First Things, The Pillar, and Word on Fire. She's also the creator of a Substack called Other Feminism. When looking for a speaker for this topic tonight, I was looking for a woman who understood three things: the struggle of infertility, also someone who was well-versed in the inherent moral and ethical issues that surround IVF, and also would be able to clearly articulate the Catholic Church's teaching on these issues. Leah checks all those boxes. So welcome. We'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to begin by considering two statistics. Today, 1 out of every 50 births is a baby who is conceived through IVF. So if you think about that concretely, that means if you walk through a school, I think teachers certainly prefer that classrooms not get above 25 kids per class, so visit 2 classrooms, and statistically, if they're representative of America, you've seen at least 1 child who was conceived by IVF. We know, of course, in our own lives, a variety of children, of parents, of cousins. It's hard to imagine anyone in this room or anyone in America who isn't personally connected to someone they love, who was either conceived by IVF or is the parent who's turned to IVF. Consider another number. It's very tricky to estimate exactly how many frozen embryos there are in America today. The industry doesn't like to publish numbers. There's no legal requirement that they do, but there have been a couple attempts to estimate it through surveys of reproductive endocrinologists, et cetera. And in 2003, the number of children on ice was estimated to be 400,000 in America. Today, 20 years later, it's estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood between 1 million and 1,500,000 children. So let's make that number concrete as well. This looks like a pretty well-sized parish. So on Christmas, I think it's pretty plausible that you can fit 300 people in here, maybe even without all their knees having to touch. But maybe, it is a standing room only Christmas with every pew filled to the brim so that you almost don't need the heat on because everyone is pressed in here so tightly. 300 people gathered for Christmas in a nation of 300 million. If you juxtapose the numbers here at the scale of a parish, you would have 300 people crowded together in the warm light of a Christmas Mass, and 1 tiny child in proportion outside in the cold and the dark. And in every church all across America, for every 300 people gathered together in joy, there would be 1 tiny child outside, alone, while their parents and possibly their siblings were inside in the warmth and the light. That's what 1 million children means. So what does that mean for us today? It means that we live in a nation where the number of victims of IVF and the number of people who are profoundly grateful for IVF and couldn't imagine their lives differently are both increasing massively day by day, year by year. The rate of IVF is only going up. The number of children left alone is only going up. So what would have been 1 child for every 2 parishes back in 2003 is now 1 child per 300 people gathered together in joy. And in another 20 years, there will be 2 children, more, a cluster of children alone. What does that mean for our potential to witness to a culture with multiplying victims and people grateful for this scientific innovation? I think successfully witnessing in this kind of culture means starting by asking, how did we get here? IVF begins with hope. And it's important to start there. No one does evil except for the sake of a perceived good. And the good that draws people to IVF is very good indeed. It's a love of children, and it's a sense that you are allowed to persist in hope when every door seems closed to you, that it's worth looking because probably there is some door somewhere that is open to you, open to your desire for love, open for your desire to children. But the reason you can do evil while in search of a perceived good is because when you allow a genuine good to eclipse a higher good, to blind you to the cost of pursuing that good at all costs, you can become entangled with evil. I think it's good to always start with the idea that there don't have to be any malice on the part of parents or even often on the part of doctors to wind up where we are now. There just has to be a slightly willful blindness to the costs of providing a hope that relies on harming someone else. IVF can feel, for parents who have struggled with infertility or with miscarriage, like a miracle, like magic. My husband and I went through a prolonged period of repeated miscarriages, and I know how much you want to look for an escape hatch, to look for some reason, something you've done wrong, something you can do right that will change everything. And we ran into some of those offers that were not illicit, but were slightly absurd even. We were told by faithful Catholic friends, look, you've been through a hard time, but if you promise to name the baby Gerald or Geraldine, it will work, because St. Gerald looks after parents who make that promise. And I didn't think that this was exactly how saints worked. I didn't disbelieve that some people had made this promise and held a baby in their arm, but I just didn't believe that God, with St. Gerald by his shoulder, was saying, like, hold off, wait till they promise to name the baby after me. We had friends who loved us bring us back crushed rocks from the Grove of La Leche in Jerusalem, at Bethlehem, actually. And they said, and it came with little packets, like, you should drink these rocks in milk to have a baby. And my husband and I looked at each other because we were very grateful to our friend, and we were very moved that he had done this, and we've never been to the Holy Land, so holding rocks from the Holy Land was special to us. We said, are we really going to have me, just me, by the way, maybe he took a sip, like, drink these rocks, which, to be honest, given that they want me to drink them, I expected to be smaller. They were more like tiny, tiny pebbles and not like dust. And so we made a deal. We said, I'm going to drink the rocks, but we have to agree that if we have a baby, we are not crediting it solely to the rocks. And I do not have to drink rocks again to try and have a baby in the future. And I did drink the rocks, and I did have a baby, and I'm not crediting the rocks alone. And I don't think anyone else struggling with infertility has to drink the rocks. But there is the sense that there must be some kind of missing deal that you can make. Name the baby this, drink the rocks, take injection after injection, go see a doctor, and someone will have something that you've neglected where you can make a deal where I will do this hard thing, and in exchange, I will have a baby. People talk sometimes as though IVF is, a mere commercialization of birth, and I think that's obviously untrue for anyone who's undergone it. You do not put $25,000 in a vending machine and take a baby out, right? What you do is go through a prolonged, difficult medical process of constant injections, constant doctor's visits, surgery, and then you possibly get a baby on the other side. You exchange one form of uncertainty for another, very expensive and physically difficult one. But still, there's that sense of, there must be a path open for me. And maybe, honestly, if it's a very hard path, that means it will work. Maybe I haven't done anything hard enough, and that's why the baby hasn't come, or the babies have not lived. Again, I saw that pitch again and again in infertility groups of just, well, have you tried cutting out almost every single food you actually eat? Because if you try hard enough, maybe you will have a baby. And if you haven't tried everything, Do you even want to be a mother? And I didn't believe that. Again, I thought when there was no known medical issue, it was all right to just stick with prayer. And I didn't have to keep going, well, if I haven't tried every hard thing, I'm not trying hard enough to be a mom. But I think the difficulty of IVF can be appealing. There's a doctor to shepherd you through it, and hard things will keep happening to your body, and maybe you can turn them into a child. In some ways, the pitch of IVF is a kind of magic I associate with fairy tales, right? You make a certain kind of bargain, you go to someone who can offer you a deal, and you get the desire of your heart. And just like in a fairy tale, when you make deals with the wrong kind of person, there's a shadowy, unspoken cost. And as Catholics, we think there are several costs to IVF, but I think the most obvious, the one that anyone kind of, whatever their philosophy can see, is that IVF requires that in exchange for your baby, you create something that isn't quite a baby, as the doctor will describe it. Not quite a changeling either, as a fairy tale might describe it, but in order to have one successful transfer, IVF doctors will tell you you should be trying to make 2 to 4 embryos for every child you intend to have. And that's because the failure rate for IVF is pretty serious. That parents seeking to have a child through IVF who have come there because of the repeated griefs of miscarriage or infertility are probably signing up for new, fresh griefs when they make a transfer and their baby doesn't make it. So doctors say you need enough spare that you'll be able to make it through this process. And for some parents, that will work out exactly as the averages will predict, losing 1 child, 2 children through transfers that end in miscarriage, and then bringing 1 baby to term. Nothing left over. But of course, some parents will be luckier. The first baby will make it. And then the parents suddenly have this new relationship and this new responsibility to the children they have conceived, who are brother or sister to the baby they're holding. And now they have to make an active, deliberate choice about what will I do with this child I have conceived but am not carrying. Now, for some people in the IVF space, that's a feature, not a bug of IVF. Because the more children you create, the more you multiply choice for the parents. And we live in a culture that treats choice as one of the highest possible goods. That something that is chosen is presumed to be more valuable than something that is unchosen. Something done deliberately is better than something received open-handed as a gift. So when you multiply embryos in the hopes of both covering your risk of losing a child, the doctors will point out, in America at least, and most of the rest of the world this is banned, all right, well, we've got 5 embryos that are eligible for transfer. They all look good enough. We've got 3 boys and 2 girls. What do you want? And then parents suddenly face a choice that no parent has naturally of, what do we want? Do we want a boy or a girl? Well, I may have hoped for this and you may have hoped for that, but now we have to sit down together and talk about who do we want to transfer of these 5 embryos? Which child are we choosing from among this quintet of siblings? And which children, by not choosing, are we leaving in abeyance, depending on our future plans? For some people who work in IVF, the choice should be even larger, a broader range of children to choose from. One woman who's founded an IVF company called Orchid, or technically a screening company that works with IVF companies, has frozen several dozen embryos of her own and not carried or transferred any yet. But she wants to do this, wants to freeze so many embryos because her company is about saying, all right, well, you've got a number of embryos on ice. Let's rank order them, best to worst. Now, she doesn't say that she traffics in values. She's very quick to disclaim that values exist. She says she provides a service that serves parents' values. So you can decide, I'm just ranking them by boys versus girls, whichever kind of child is more valuable to me. But she offers polygenetic screening so that you can say, all right, I've got 5, 3 boys, 2 girls. What color eyes are they predicted to have? All right. I'm looking for boys with blue eyes, so I'm restricting to these 3, and now I'm picking this one. She wants to offer it for a much wider variety of cases and claims she can, though I think it's a little early to judge the merit of her claims, so that you could rank order your children based on height, based on projected intelligence, based on projected risk for heart disease. And she frames this again and again as serving health. Wouldn't any parent, she say, want to do their best for their child? Wouldn't they want to give their child the best? But she's always very slippery about the fact that she's not curing any of those kids, of that quintet of 5 if you've got one with heart disease. Nothing she's selling lets you treat the girl with a higher than average risk of heart disease. She's not offering CRISPR to modify genes in utero. You could debate whether or not that was even a good idea, but that would be directed towards the good of that one girl embryo. She's saying you can pick which baby to have, and the ones that look not as good, you'll get rid of. That's not curing. That's very straightforwardly eugenics. It's just eugenics before the parents have a chance to meet the children that they are weighing the value of. This woman, Noor of Orchid, is very bald-faced about what she's selling and very honest, to her partial credit, that it works best when parents create far more embryos than they intend to transfer. So they have a broader range of children to choose from. The more embryos, the more variation, the more chance to pick someone who's projected to have a 5-point higher IQ than the lowest ranked embryo. And for that, why not make a dozen? But even at an ordinary IVF clinic, parents are always counseled to stay on the safe side, to make more so that they don't run out of time, don't run out of options. And of course, once you have them, there's room for some discussion about which one you'll transfer, because the parents must choose. The act of separating childbearing from lovemaking means that parents are not opening themselves up to a gift, letting their love result in the creation of someone who's a stranger to them, but working with a doctor to describe and enumerate their existing children and make a choice between them. And we know already the effects that making a child into a choice can have. In countries that conduct universal screening for Down syndrome, parents have spoken about what a burden this placed on them versus forgoing screening at all. Parents spoke in an Atlantic article with Sarah Zhang about how, because they knew everyone in their community knew Down screening was standard, when they walked through their community with their child with Down syndrome, everyone thought, you chose this for your child. Not, you received your child, this is your child. But everyone knew you were warned and plunged ahead anyway. And they carried the burden of feeling like, in some way, even though they had chosen life, because it was a choice, that when people looked at them, they saw all their child's difficulties laid at their parents' feet, as though their parents had chosen each medical travail and given it to the child, rather than receive the child as they were. That increasingly, asking parents to choose whether a child lives or dies, or choose which of their children to give a chance at life, puts a heavy burden on parents, who then consider for each trait their child might have, am I picking this for my child versus am I saying yes to this child who is already here? IVF has this logic of contingency that goes along with its offering choice. If it's a choice, then there's a kind of double vision for each of the embryos that the doctor is presenting you with. Each of these 5 children could be your beloved baby who you will hold and take pictures of, or they could stay on ice indefinitely as a spare. And the clinic will always advertise with pictures of babies. What they say they're offering you is a baby, but what they'll keep for you is not a baby. So it relies on this sort of doubled vision, where it's the parent's view of the child that determines who the child is. And this is, of course, familiar to us from the logic that surrounds the legality of abortion. That every child who is a wanted child is valued, can even be treated fully legally as a person if something happens to the mother. But if the mother doesn't want the child, they're assumed to not have any independent existence if her desire does not align with her wanting that child to go on. Now, in abortion, I think this kind of doubled vision has persisted for a very long time because the only person's view that's assumed to matter is the mother's. That when people face the choice for life, the mother is already carrying the child and is the one person who our law says has the capacity to decide what happens to the child. Because IVF separates the baby from the mother and the father right from the start, it's actually become a lot trickier to carry over this doubled vision. In abortion rhetoric, you can say, well, it's just what the mother thinks, and that flips the baby from a person or not a person. But IVF gets a lot more tangled a lot more quickly, and it actually gets bogged down in court cases a lot more quickly, where a judge can't work with this idea of who thinks what about the baby and manage to make good law. So I want to talk a little about two recent court cases that hinged on IVF, which I think did a very good job of holding up clearly how incoherent the philosophy of IVF is and how untenable it is, even as a matter of secular law. A few years ago in Alabama, a cluster of parents sued their IVF clinic. And they sued the clinic because the clinic had accidentally thawed their children, which meant the embryos ceased to be viable, could not be transferred. The parents lost their hope of bringing them to term. Now, no one disputed at any point in this case that the clinic was at fault. It wasn't a clinic worker who had done this, but they'd failed to secure the area where the embryos were kept. And apparently, someone just wandered in, opened the door, pulled out a DWAR full of frozen nitrogen, pulled out a tube, and went, "What's this? It's burning my fingers," because it's in frozen nitrogen, dropped it, and destroyed several children at a stroke. Nothing about the case turned on, was the clinic negligent? Yes. The question was, what kind of way had the clinic wronged these parents? What kind of damages could the clinic be liable for? Had the clinic endangered the parents' property, or had it harmed their children? Alabama law already allowed for the ability to claim damages from someone who negligently or otherwise harmed your child before birth. This was certainly before birth. Was it children? That's what the case turned on. The parents said, yes, these are our children. We hope to hold them in our arms. We're not able to because of your negligence. We want the damages due to us as parents. The clinic said, as one of the arguments it raised in lower courts, though not in the final court where it's decided, look, you've already conceded that these aren't fully children to the parents. When the parents show up and freeze embryos, they have to specify what they want done with any embryos they don't use. And several of the parents in the case had specified either that they wanted unused embryos turned over for research purposes or discarded. And the clinic said, you have already conceded by your own choices that these are not fully children as frozen embryos, because obviously you can't say, I want my full children thrown away. So you can't come after us for damages as though these are kids when you didn't treat them like kids in the first place. Which obviously is not what they put in the brochures, right? This only came up when they were legally liable. The judge sided with the parents. And the moment that Alabama court said these parents are eligible for full damages to their children because of your negligence, the clinic said, then we will not operate in Alabama and we're shutting down effective immediately. And several other clinics in the state did likewise. This caused such a furor that the Alabama state legislature got together and they said, look, this is unacceptable. Maybe the judge did right under current Alabama law, but happily we can fix that. We're going to add a carve-out to our laws protecting children to say explicitly that IVF clinics cannot be held liable for damage to children even if they negligently destroy embryos. This happened very quickly. It was a bipartisan effort, and the clinics reopened. And I do want to dwell not just on the philosophical question the judge was weighing, but what the clinics thought the stakes were. They weren't being held liable for destroying children when they thawed embryos according to the parents' wishes. It was only when they were criminally negligent that they were facing these risks at all. But for the clinics, any amount of legal exposure was untenable. They said it would break their business model, and they would not do business in a state that expected them to be held to these standards. Across the country, IVF is wildly unregulated, and whenever there are attempts to impose regulation, including just regulation of, please tell us every year how many frozen embryos are in your DWARs so we have a sense of just what's going on here, please publish your success rates, the clinics say, if you ask us to do this, we'll shut down. And because 1 out of every 50 children is born through IVF, there are always parents to call legislatures to say, we wouldn't have our baby but for this clinic. Please don't endanger their business model. Please don't rob other parents of hope like ours. So they've managed to carve out a relatively lawless sphere of action, even when they've genuinely abused their responsibilities. And in the meantime, it's for the judges to clean up and say, well, you did something wrong, but what exactly did you do wrong? Because IVF separates children from lovemaking, from mother and father right from the start, IVF babies keep winding up not just in criminal liability cases, but they keep winding up in family court. Because due to IVF, it is possible for a mother and father to conceive children together, but never transfer them or begin to carry them to term or consider the question until after they've already decided they are divorcing. And so, their embryos wind up as part of the settlement questions of the divorce. To whom do they belong? Who can make a claim on them? And especially, what happens when the parents disagree about whether they want their children to be brought into the world at all? In a recent case in Virginia, 2 parents were divorcing. Two parents, as we would consider them, though not yet as they considered themselves, and they had 2 embryos on ice. The mother wanted to carry a baby to term. The father did not want either baby to be transferred to her or to anyone else. Now, the mother made the pitch that often in a divorce, when the 2 people have something and they don't agree on what to do about it, and you can, in theory, split it up, each person gets half and they get to decide for themselves. In some cases, even when people really can't agree on what to do about an asset, the judge will even direct them to sell the asset and they just split the money. Obviously not an option here. But so if there were 2 embryos, shouldn't she by rights at least have 1 that she could do whatever she wanted with? And her husband, if he didn't want to transfer an embryo, could do what he wanted with his, but she had a right to half? The judge had some trouble with this. He was trying to weigh the issue. This was most appropriate under precedents of family law if the embryos were, as a matter of law, goods or chattel. Then, unambiguously, you can split those things up, even Stephen. And the judge was kind of wrestling with this. He's thinking, well, embryos aren't per se saleable. They don't have a market price yet. So they're not obviously goods or chattel, but no one is quite claiming that they're persons, so what can I do? And then after a little bit, he went away and figured out that he had case law in Virginia to rely on that would clarify the issue. He said, well, here in Virginia, we actually have a long history of prior case law about what to do with persons that are considered to be goods or chattel. So he can look at prior divorce cases that revolved around the resolution of who had possession of slaves to decide what to do with these embryos. Both parents found this method of resolution profoundly unsettling. Neither of them, despite their disagreements with each other, wanted to be repeatedly in the papers as they were for a case where a judge was relying on Virginia's common law about slaves to decide what to do with their children. The judge eventually apologized for reaching for the legal analogy, but in his defense, it is very hard in American law to find any case where persons can be divided up as though they were goods, and the ones we have we find repugnant. The problem the judge had is that for the wife to succeed and claim at least one of the children to carry to term, to birth, to recognize as a child, as a person, she needed them as a matter of law not to be treated as persons, but as goods that could be divided up. For the father to succeed, to keep the embryos on ice indefinitely, and then presumably one day discard them, he needed them to be treated as persons, distinct, non-fungible, where no one could say, well, I get one and you get the other, and that's obviously the same thing. He needed them to be persons to keep them from being carried to term and given their first breath. I think they're still bogged down in appeals and counter motions because there isn't an obvious way to resolve this, and they're not the only parents to be stuck in this sort of limbo of endless legal fights about which parent wants to bring a child out of the icebox and into the womb, and which parent says, I reject the idea that you can do that with my, not quite child, my genetic material, which I have a say in. We keep getting bogged down here because we're disconnecting children from the process that makes them. We're inventing novel legal questions that require us to turn back to our old legal wrongs because we are alienating children from their parents from the moment they come into existence. There has never been a parallel word for orphan for a child who lacks their mother and father, whose mother and father are alive. Until now, we might need one. A name for a child who is disavowed by their parents or abandoned by one of the parents and the other parent can't prevail in law, so exists, has two genetic parents, but is not claimed as child by either. Part of what brought us here is this intense fear of a genuine openness to life. Not just when it comes to IVF, not just when it comes to abortion, but in our day-to-day life, the idea that parenthood always, no matter how you come by your children, entails opening yourself up to risk. That even when you don't select your child from a menu, when you can't rank them, that the children you have are not fully your own. That no matter how much you wanted them to come into existence in the first place, there was never a moment where you could say, and now I will us to conceive. And then it happens. Children always enter the world as a gift, sometimes a longed-for gift, sometimes an unasked for or even unwanted gift. But they come when mother and father come together, and when beyond them, their love spills over into something beyond their own plans and own authorship. Here's where we get a little beyond the secular culture we move in. But I think it's significant that parenthood is for most people the most common experience of accepting a responsibility that exceeds your ability to discharge. As Christians, we think that happens in part because God is in the mix, that we accept the responsibility to love someone we do not know, we did not pick out of a lineup, and whose future we cannot conceive. That even the child born entirely healthy at birth may go through any number of crosses or travails, so the parent who thinks, I am not like that parent who chose Down syndrome for their child may still find that they are in fact responsible for a child with significant differences, severe disability, prolonged illness, because saying yes to a child is saying yes to that child's whole life, no matter what the ultrasound or amniocentesis tells you. It tells you a little about who your child is right now. It does not make you a promise about the long-term rippling effects of your love for your child. Becoming a parent means accepting responsibility for someone who you hope and pray every day will outlive you, who you will not be able to protect till the end, who you will entrust to others, and whose end you will not see in this lifetime. I think that part of parenthood is very frightening in our current culture, where parents think a lot about what it means to be a fully responsible parent, what it means to eat exactly the right foods from the moment you start trying to have a baby, what it means to be virtuous in various health-ridden ways, to pick the best baby once you're given the choice, to get them into the best programs, to at every moment to think, everything that's wrong with my child is my fault. I ate the wrong thing while I was pregnant. I didn't pick the right embryo of the two boys with blue eyes, and if I hadn't, everything might be different. I didn't stay up till midnight for the summer camp registration and someone else got in ahead of me. Everything is my fault, ultimately. At all those different scales. This isn't a new temptation or a new fear. In the Middle Ages, parents worried that if a mother looked at the wrong thing while pregnant, her child would be born with its mark. A mother who looked at a fire while pregnant might have a baby born with a blazing red birthmark. There has always been a sense that parents are responsible for their children, but are fearfully responsible for their children, more focused on avoiding risk than embracing life. As Christians, we have every reason to believe that we are tasked with stepping out in faith, stepping out in courage, understanding that by accepting a child, we accept also some of the graces meant to be given to us to steward this child, and not just by ourselves, but to say genuinely, by becoming, in my case, a parent to 3 children so far, I have accepted a responsibility I do not have the strength to discharge. I'm married, so that helps. So now there's 2 of us, but there's 3 of them so far. And again, we pray they outlive us. And the more children we have, the greater the odds that one of them will be born with a significant congenital difference, or one of them will have a serious fall from one of the things our 3-year-old likes to climb, or one of them will fall in love with someone whose life is marked by physical difference, and that we will once again find that we love people, that our own strengths and our own gifts are not enough to keep fully safe or keep fully whole. The temptation of IVF is that parenthood is a matter of managing risk, of choosing best, of making children small so that they are small enough to keep safe. As I said from the start, this is a desire for a real partial good. Every parent longs to be able to keep their children safe. And every parent knows that for their children to have a large and flourishing life, we have to accept that they will move beyond our capacity to protect and be hurt and make serious mistakes. And no matter how many embryos you line up, you won't find one that is free of risk, ultimately. But all throughout our culture, people are catechized to think that the best life is an independent life, a life that is stable enough, simple enough, healthy enough, that you will never need too much from other people, and that ideally no one else will ever need too much from you. That you will not find yourself loving beyond your means. And the only way of achieving that goal is to have a small life. The only way of living a fully independent, autonomous, strong life is to not have enough people that you love who can become sick, who were disabled from the start, who you yourself may find slipping into profound need. When we aspire for what's best for our children, when I think about what I want for my children, I do not hope that they achieve all of their dreams. I do not hope that everything in their life goes well. I hope many things, and I do hope my 3-year-old makes it, let's say, to 7 with no broken bones, because I think she'll be able to handle it better at that point. But I'm not a betting woman, right? I've got 3 kids so far, so what are the odds of no broken arms before 7? 30%? I don't know. I hope that my children have a life that is open enough to love, that several of their goals are just utterly interrupted, that several of their plans are completely thrown off course because someone they love needs them, and that they have to put aside things that they thought were good, that are good, for the sake of that love. That a life that is not interrupted is a life that is not open to enough needy people. We're gathered tonight here just after the Vigil Mass, so we're kind of at the hinge. Liturgically, we're already in All Souls Day, but we're at the hinge between All Saints and All Souls Day. And all throughout November, we pray for the souls in purgatory. I'm a convert to Catholicism, so my first experience with the word purgatory was, I think, the more secular use of it. I was waiting forever for the doctor. It's like I was in purgatory, right? This sense of purgatory as this endless, fruitless, open-ended wait a bad place, right? A place of just infinite stasis. That's not what Catholics believe purgatory to be, and that's not the kind of place we're praying about throughout this month. Purgatory is a place where victory is already assured. And what we are waiting for and praying for the people we love who are in purgatory is for them to fully respond to God's grace that is already acting on them, to heal every wound of sin from life, to lay down every burden, and finally walk freely and joyfully through the doors into heaven. A lot of the teachings of purgatory, are a little mysterious for all of us, but what we know is every soul in purgatory will see God. It's not an endless wait. It's not a dark and static place. It is a place of pilgrimage, of climbing to the light, of receiving a promise and waiting faithfully and with hope to see it fulfilled. I would contrast that with the purgatory that exists in the full secular sense, a time of endless stasis, frozen, dark, and lonely, which exists probably not too far a drive from here, at some IVF clinic with hundreds of children on ice. In purgatory, our loved ones rest in God's mercy, which is an active force. In our world, the brothers and sisters of people we already know and love are waiting for our mercy, for us to make a different choice and to say, the good of children cannot be pursued in this way. To say, because we love your brothers and sisters, because we are genuinely glad to know them, we cannot go another day thinking of you alone without them, thinking of you, almost their twin, brought to life in the same instant, staying alone, small and vulnerable, while your brother or sister, who could have been your twin, is walking, is running, is going off to college, is considering whether to have children of their own, and whether, on that journey to seek children, they will add several more children, your nieces and nephews, to wait in indefinite lonely darkness alongside you. People are moved to IVF because they are correct that children are good. And I will say that our great advantage in this fight is that all we are saying in response is, all children are good. And because we love the children that you have found in this way, we think the way that you found them was illicit. Because we can see how much you are moved by the goodness of a child, we want you to join us in rejecting a process that separates children into beloved and abandoned. Thank you. And now I'm happy to take either pre-written questions, questions at the mic, etc.
If you'd like. Is this on? It is on. Oh, great. Okay. All right. If you have questions, please write them, bring them in, or you can actually just come up here too. I've got some here already that were in there. Let's see. Let me find one.
And if you have questions, just line up near the mic.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I have one for you, Leah. Are there ways to do IVF in a moral way?
So from the church's point of view, no. There are ways to do IVF in a less immoral way. And I think it does matter that when people seek this out, it is better that there are people trying to think through, well, what is wrong with this? Can we contain the harms? And some of the harms of making and freezing so many children can be limited. America, as I said, is very unusual in our legal treatment of IVF. In many other countries around the world, it's not permitted to tell parents what sexes the children are. It's not permitted to let them pick. People fly to America to do IVF here because America offers them the chance to order their children from a menu, and other countries don't. That is less immoral. Other countries limit how many embryos you can make at a time to avoid multiplying children past what you plausibly will transfer. Less immoral. But the thing that's at the heart of IVF, that I think all the troubles for the children who are left over are, again, more discernible even for a secular culture. They're something you can bring to almost anyone you know as a genuine injustice and try and connect. But the Catholic Church says there's a further immorality that can't be taken away, and it is separating conception from sex. And I think part of the weight of that was actually given voice very well by New York Times writer Ross Douthat when he interviewed Noor, the creator of Orchid. And he read her a poem that I don't have with me at the time, but he read her a poem that's called "After We Make Love, We Hear Footsteps." And it's about, and I recommend looking it up because it's very moving, it's about parents who, after making love, often hear their child running back towards the bed. And that there's a way that this recalls to them what they've just done, right? Even when they don't seek to have a child, that the act of coming together physically in love is always oriented towards the possibility of being joined by someone new. That our love for each other as man and wife is so great that it always has the potential to overspill and become a whole new person. For me, speaking entirely for myself, not as a theologian, it does always recollect to me the image of the Trinity, that God begetting the Son, and then the love between him and the Son giving rise to the Holy Spirit. I am butchering the Trinity slightly for all the priests in the room, as everyone does when trying to explain the Trinity. But I do come back to that image that this is one of the ways we participate in God's love, that our love for each other can create a person. IVF is always oriented towards denying that that is what sex is. And when Douthat read the poem, tearing up on his podcast to the CEO of Orchid, he's like, well, don't you think that there's something lost when sex doesn't always bring to mind children? And she goes, what? And she wasn't being snide. She just had a total incomprehension of what was moving to him. I think it wasn't irrelevant that he does have children with his wife, and she does not. I don't think you have to have children to understand this, but there was a genuine joy in Douthat that she didn't reject, she couldn't comprehend. And I think IVF always moves us away from understanding the genuine weight and joy of sex.
I think what she also said during that interview was that sex should be for fun and IVF should be for children. That was her bottom line on that.
She says that a lot. It's a tagline for the company.
I have something I want to make everyone here aware of. So I give to an adoption agency called Nightlight Christian Adoptions. So they have traditional adoptions all the way from teenagers to babies, both foreign and domestic. But they also offer an adoption of embryos. And they've been very successful at this. Very. Doesn't get to the root cause of our question, but I know for sure from their newsletters they have over 1,000 children that have been adopted, embryos that have been adopted and given to. It's a process like any adoption, gone to other families who are unable to have children of their own, and they've adopted these embryos and brought them to be children or be born. So what do you think of that organization?
I think embryo adoption is a profoundly compassionate response to a profoundly unjust system. And I'd actually draw a parallel that touches on my own life, which is that my husband is one of 4 children, 3 boys, and 1 girl adopted from China. His parents adopted her because they wanted to grow their family. They wanted to provide a home to someone who needed one. And it's so lovely because not only is she a beautiful light in their life, not only did she help form him for fatherhood, because he'd changed way more diapers than I had when we got married, but you see how she's picked up mannerisms from the whole family, right? So there's a unity to the family. But why were they able to adopt her? They were able to adopt her because of China's one-child policy, and because of their relentless persecution of parents who tried to keep their children, and because of the intense misogyny that meant parents preferentially gave up their daughters. So I would say there was nothing wrong, and much that was generous and beautiful, about parents in America who sought to adopt children from China. And similarly, it's admirable and generous that people adopt abandoned embryos now. But in neither case should we describe that act of generosity as kind of absorbing enough that's bad about the system that we could allow it to persist. It is a comfort to me that my husband and I, when we were having miscarriages, we were starting to explore, well, should we adopt from China too? Should we kind of carry this on for a second generation? And we weren't able to, for a couple of reasons, including you have to both be over 30. But it was partly because China had ended its one-child policy. They haven't attained a healthy relationship with their children or their girls in full. But it's a profound joy to me that it is now nearly impossible for Americans to adopt from China, even as it's a profound joy that his sister is part of my life. And I kind of hope in the same way that as many children as possible are freed from the DWARs and adopted when that's possible, and that the store is completely exhausted, and that even parents who then would have hoped to welcome a child that way have their hopes frustrated because there are no more children abandoned.
I should say also there is an article at the back table there that this is an issue that has not been fully decided in church teaching. And there are, I think, is Father James here? Is there going to be some debate going on between two people about the pros and cons of this? I think it's also called snowflake adoptions. And there are issues, pro and con, and there's this great article from the Center for Bioethics from the Catholic Church that looks at all the nuances. And I think, as you said, it's a situation where you try to find justice, bring justice out of a situation that was not a good, probably just situation in the beginning. But there is an article in the back there that you can take a look at for that too. All right. This one is kind of a combination of two questions here. One is wondering, or they're both kind of wondering, what are the health risks to the mother who undergoes IVF? Kind of the question is, have there been any studies correlating IVF procedures and like recent surges in breast cancer in women in their 30s or their 40s, or any other health risks that would come to mind?
So I'm not a medical doctor. I have a statistics background, so I'll speak a little broadly here. There are some greater risks for IVF than natural conception, though some of these are partly explained by the fact that women undergoing IVF aren't exactly comparable to women who are succeeding at conceiving naturally, right? So because we know they're in an IVF clinic already, we know either they're having certain troubles with their cycles, they have other chronic health conditions that led them to struggle to conceive, conditions that may not be fully treated when their doctor moves straight to IVF rather than to treatment. So it's hard to fully compare these populations. I don't always lead with the risks of IVF, even though they do exist, because I think for parents, they're not, or aspiring parents, they're not convincing. If you tell someone who wants a child, did you know pregnancy is risky? Of course they say, yes, and I'm willing to undergo this for my child. When you follow up with, did you know IVF is slightly, ambiguously, but somewhat riskier for you? I think many mothers or people who want to be mothers reasonably say like, okay, sign me up. I'm willing to do it. So I think the risks are there, but I think it's a weaker argument against IVF. And of course, it's always vulnerable to people just getting better at doing it and the risks falling back to baseline. As for breast cancer, I'd expect it to be slightly protective because nursing always lowers breast cancer risk. Therefore, if you succeed at having a baby with IVF, it probably lowers the incidence rates of certain kinds of breast cancer. But again, like with the kind of statistical question that comes up, abortion raises your risk of breast cancer primarily because you do not nurse. And I just don't think people who are contemplating having an abortion here, you have a slightly higher risk of a not extremely common breast cancer mediated through not nursing. Do you still want to have the abortion? I don't think almost any of them say, good point, right? Like that's not the primary thing weighing on their mind.
I just want to, first of all, just commend you. Your presentation was phenomenal. And I was blown away. I mean, I came in here realizing IVF was bad, and I agree with the church's teaching. But you have filled me with many things to contemplate. And you talked about parenthood is about managing risk, or that's what IVF it tries to accomplish. But one of the things I have a question is, the challenge with IVF as well as abortion is the idea that the child is not a child, and it's too small. You know, how do you address that? How do you get people to think that it's a human? It's the sperm comes together with the egg and creates a human immediately, and the soul is created. And how do you address that more?
I think you seldom ever convince people with a single knockdown argument where then they feel, I have to concede. Like, it's the building up of many small pieces of evidence. So I'll discuss a couple pieces that I think make an impact, though I think none of these, I hope I'm wrong, but I think none of these, when you show them to one person, will cause them to immediately flip. One is that I think one of the most powerful pieces of pro-life propaganda, if I may say, is made by a non-pro-life neutral source. It's the Bump app, and it's pictures of pregnancy throughout, week by week, little 3D images of the child. Because when I was pregnant with a baby I ultimately lost through miscarriage, I was 8 weeks pregnant, I was at work, I had told people I was pregnant, and I passed around my phone and I said, this is what the baby looks like. And I said, because this is one of the things that stood out, the baby has his or her final set of kidneys. And I didn't know people had more than one. But you have a proto set of kidneys and then already a next set of kidneys that early. And we passed it around, and the baby doesn't look like a newborn, but it doesn't look like a clump of cells either. And people said, is this really what the baby looks like? I'm like, it is. And I hadn't realized that either. And part of the reason I hadn't is I grew up pro-choice. I'd heard clump of cells forever. I had seen pro-lifers like shake little plastic babies at me, and I just hadn't believed them. I thought they were in bad faith or deceived themselves because I didn't trust them as a messenger. But for both me and my coworkers, no one thought the Bump was doing something sneaky or lying to moms. So it made a bigger impact than it would have from a different voice. That's kind of the very immediate look at the baby, right? I think one of the other pieces is the more philosophical argument of, well, when are you going to make this division? And I think what's tricky is most people don't think very deeply about, are my positions here totally philosophically coherent? And in fairness, people don't think this about most things they believe in life anyway. It's not that they're being, very lazy as thinkers when it comes to the life issue, but rigorous elsewhere. For the most part, we try and do things we think are good, that people in our community think are good, and that means you don't have to check all the weak points. But I've really pushed a lot on the viability dividing line, which I think a number of people hold to because it's what Casey held. So for a long time in America, abortion law was governed by Casey, which let states regulate abortion or not based on viability. And what I've brought up to people, because I think people are attached to it, they grew up with it, it sounds fair. It sounds like, well, the baby can live without their mother after this point, but not here. I said, look, viability has changed a lot. When President Kennedy lost his son, who was delivered premature at, I think, around 31 or 32 weeks, they just didn't have the capacity to save him. We didn't know enough about how to help babies breathe then. But I've had multiple friends deliver at 32 weeks, and it was scary, and their baby spent a long time in the NICU. But the whole time, doctors could say, pretty straightforwardly, we have every expectation your baby will make it. We just think the next few weeks are going to be really hard for you and your baby. The viability line changed. It was further back by Casey, but even now it's crept back further as we've improved our NICU and incubator technology, and also, and this is kind of hopeful and sad, hospitals that try harder to save babies get better at it. So hospitals with equivalently leveled NICUs, one of them may be better to go to if you're at 22 weeks because the doctors try. And therefore, they've gotten better than the hospital that says 22 weeks is really borderline and we can't do much. Now, even then, at 22 weeks, a quarter to half of babies survive, depending on the NICU. So it's not the case. It's nothing like 32 weeks. No doctor will look you in the eye and say, honestly, we have every expectation you'll go home with your baby. What they can say is, we're going to give your baby the best chance we can, but we also want to give you time with your baby if we can't. That makes a big difference. But that implies that our sense of when do you become a person is contingent on how good the incubators are, or on whether the doctor you're delivering with thinks your baby's life is worth living. And I hope sometimes that I don't convince anyone on that. I just hope they go like, that is a little unsatisfying. And they go home to think, well, what do I think? What do I have instead? What are my options here? I think the last thing is that the thing that makes it very hard for people to change their mind is they're always thinking about a possible real harm to someone they know, a grown woman whose life will be changed by pregnancy, and they have someone they're not sure about and someone they are sure about. That often leads people to err on that side. Because I ran a discussion group between people who are pro-choice and pro-life, and one of the folks there was a guy who was vegan, and he said, like, I understand that everywhere else in my life, my approach is, if something looks like it might be suffering or capable of suffering, I should presume it's capable of suffering, and that's a safer way to go through life than saying, I'm not sure, so I can do whatever I want to it. He's like, and I can see, Leah, why you think that should put me here. But since I'm not a woman, I don't feel comfortable asking someone else to make sacrifices on that assumption versus I'm willing to eat no meat, wear no leather myself. I think that's always the challenge is, and there again, I think that's someone who wants to act morally. That's what you're trying to connect with. You're willing to make sacrifices. You think they can be merited. You think we have to be attentive to the suffering we could neglect. And you're nervous about asking someone else to sacrifice wrongly. All of those are good instincts. My goal is that you kind of reassemble them differently.
Okay. What are compassionate and thoughtful ways to support couples struggling with infertility?
I'll say one I think is bad first as something to avoid. I think it's never, ever, ever a good idea to say, don't worry, it will work out eventually. People did say that to me. It did work out eventually in some sense. I still don't like it and I reject it. And in part because it always sounded to me like they were saying, I'm sorry that your baby has died, but probably one day there will be a different baby who doesn't die, and then when you put them next to each other, it will even out. I know that's not what they meant, but it's what it sounded like, right? So I think with infertility, both inability to conceive a child and through miscarriage, it's better not to talk too much about the future that you can't promise or predict, and just to genuinely be with someone and say, I am so sorry you lost your baby. What meant the most to me, and I cannot guarantee this means the most to every person, it's just, I wish I could have met your baby. Versus, I'm sure the next one won't die, like slightly less baldly stated, right? But you would never say that to someone at a funeral, right? So I think moving more in the direction, how do you sit with someone that's grieving versus how do you rush someone past grief to hope? One time when I was pregnant with a baby who did not die, one of my friend's kids who she'd had pray for us, so she knew what had happened, but was little, so like 5 to 7 range, like came up to me and like, I hope your baby doesn't die. Which I'm not saying you should say that to people per se, but it was so bold, but it was what I hoped. It was more comforting to me than people saying, I'm sure this will work out, or let's hope for the best. Like, I was like, yes, I hope this baby does not die too, right? That's why I think like with anything in grief, there's not a single phrase that will work for everyone, but thinking more about this as accompanying people through grief is the way I would start. Oh, actually, and the other one is for infertility, period, thinking about what you can do to make room for this person to give space to their maternal or paternal love. So my family has always tried to pick for godparents to think for each child at least one person who's either a consecrated religious or unmarried and wishing they were married, or married and struggling with fertility as one of the godparents. Because then we're guaranteeing there is one child in particular this person is responsible for the entire rest of their life. Like we can't guarantee they have a baby, but we can give them our baby.
So considering that there are many people that are here because of IVF, are there any groups of people who are IVF babies that are now older and what are their thoughts about how they were conceived or what their life is like? Or, I mean, they must be in a situation where I'm really glad I'm here. Mm-hmm. Is there a but after that or not?
For some of them. I would not say for all of them. And I think it's also more complicated when people are conceived with donor sperm or donor eggs or through surrogacy where they have a sense of, I have a tie additionally to one person who's not in my family. And you have some of the same complex feelings that people have about adoption. A sense of, is there another part of my story that I don't have access to? I would never say that most people who are conceived through IVF are unhappy about their conception. First of all, they're grateful to be here, just like anyone who was conceived in difficult circumstances. And for the most part, they're likely to have a loving family, just like anyone else. Though, of course, they may be in one of those families riven by court cases or just simple divorce after conception, like anyone else. I think, there's certainly kind of Facebook groups that will attract the people who are least happy, right? So there are people seeking support, but you shouldn't assume any particular person you meet who is conceived through IVF has a sense of incompleteness or grief that you have to start by speaking to. In almost the same way, I grew up as an atheist and I had a boyfriend in college who trying to help me was like, you can say to God, like anything you're angry about, you can be angry at him and that's okay. And I was like, I'm not angry at God. And I meant it. Like, I didn't believe in God, so there was no sense of I have anger that's unresolved. And he had a sense, which is true, that some people become atheists by being angry and wanted to give me permission to express it. But it fell flat because that wasn't true of me in particular. And I think the same is true for children conceived through IVF. There are kind of broad patterns, but don't impose those patterns on a particular individual unless they raise them.
Okay, does anybody else have a question they want to come up and ask? Okay, yep, go ahead.
Thank you for everything that you've been elucidating. It's very thought-provoking. There's a lot of, as you mentioned, heart-wrenching contingencies that I had never even contemplated. The thing that you emphasized was the humanity of all involved. And I think that's one thing that, for those that want a child at any cost, it's easy to brush past. What sort of resources, or two questions, is this talk going to be available in the future? And then secondly, what sort of resources exist out there that can help for people to begin to think about these contingencies that help people to think more deeply about the issue so that they're not brushing past the humanity of all involved? Because I think it's very humanizing to listen to you and then to hear about people's experience and then discover the humanity that's involved.
So I know you guys are taping him back, so I presume it's available later to answer the first question.
We are taping it. It's not live stream, but it will be available on the St. Odilio website.
So that's that part, and the other part's for me to answer. I think one of the big resources is this is widespread enough that there are more big stories about people's regret about extra frozen embryos or their mixed feelings or that they weren't given clear, informed consent when they got in. And that's something that you can share with someone who's thinking about this process, who's a friend or in your family, without even opening the question of, is IVF ever allowed? Is this door totally closed? And more just, here's something a lot of people wish they knew more about when they got started. How are you thinking through this as a way of starting? And actually, I find that often it's easier sometimes to open a conversation with a non-Catholic source. That's something that's not fully against IVF because people trust it more as raising issues in the same way I trusted the bump more than my pro-life friends. So I'd recommend there's a 3-part series in the New York Times by a writer called Anna Louise Sussman, who conceived a child through IVF. And she's just kind of wrestling with some of her own questions and doesn't come to a conclusion, which I think if you read it with a friend gives them more room to explore where they have feelings of ambiguity without feeling bullied into coming to agree with you. They'll read stories from folks with a variety of opinions. And Anna herself, narrates how she goes to the clinic where she conceived her first child, and they have a thing they can do for parents where they, and this is surreal to me, they tape the blastocysts dividing when you first make the embryo. So they're frozen at a certain, I think, 8-cell size, and they have them all under a microscope with a little video camera so you can watch your baby's first moments for some of your babies, right? And she does watch it, and both that's the phase where it definitely doesn't look like a baby. No one's persuaded on that. Oh, this is the exact moment where it looks like a clump of cells, and yet these are the first photos of her child, like in motion, active, doing something, and she feels weird about it. And I think often to open the conversation, you're not going for, I'm trying to convince people. You're just going with, am I trying to get them to feel a little weird and unsettled so that they need to keep reading, keep discussing to reach a point of peace? And there's a bunch of resources in back, but that's the one I'd say for someone who's most unsympathetic.
I had just 2 questions. The first, you identified yourself as a mother of 3, is that correct?
Yes.
Isn't that somewhat inconsistent because you did have children that have passed?
So I do this a couple ways depending on the context, right?
Okay.
Because if someone says, like, how many kids do you have, it's not always helpful to lead with, I have 3 who are alive and 6 who are dead, though I do that in certain contexts too.
So technically you might be considered a mother of 9.
Yeah, so that's the least helpful way of framing it for me, because then people have a false idea. The spot where I most often run into this is I'll be out with a child and someone will, my oldest especially, feel like, oh, is she your first? And that's the one I tend not to ever be satisfied saying yes to. I'm happy to say, I have 3 children, someone who's really asking how many people are following you around on little feet. But for are you your first, that for me always feels like, well, I can't say yes without ignoring my other children. So that one I tend to say, she's the first to make it to delivery. And then people go, oh, like, and are startled, or
Fair
sometimes.
enough. In the outer world, I understand that those things, but within here, if we all agree that that's a baby, then you're a mother of 9 in many ways amongst
Yeah,
the
we
believers.
named all our children, so which is really important
I
to
just
us.
caught on that. And then the second thing, I am a cradle Catholic, and I do credit people like yourself and Ross Duthot. I think the converts very much often know the theology, the official Catholic, but, and maybe I'm being idealistic here, but my belief somewhat is that God has given us so many miracles, and that science and technology, we put a man on the moon. I mean, you think about that, wow. So it's not really a question so much for you to answer, and I'm not really even debating the Catholic theology, but could we not think that maybe God would say, just as Mary did, say yes to bringing that new life, welcome that new life. And then somebody had asked about, is there a moral way to do this? Like if you just had 2, you implanted 2, you know, like the pregnancies where a woman has 9 implanted and they expected some would die, and then they all took and she delivered 8 or 9, the Makahis or something. So I don't know, when you said that there's an article in the back, if that was just on the ethics of the snowflake implantations, or if Catholics might reconsider. The Romneys are a very not Catholic family, but a very Christian or Latter-day Saints, so good people, and many of their grandchildren, is my understanding, have been through that. So, you know, as our Catholic perspective is true for us maybe, but others, you know, and maybe that's why it should be legal, so that people could have that option of saying yes. So,
Yeah,
but
you know,
I
I
do
think we
thank
all-
you for your book. I haven't read it yet. I read your Twitter and things.
Yeah,
But
let me-
it's
let me take a-
wonderful
let me
to
take a
talk
crack at
about
your
these
question.
issues and just to wrap them in our heads and what we each take from it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think we always face that question when we kind of explore the bounds of science. We now have new ethical questions. We say, all right, you know, I'm trying to get to the moon. Like, is that allowed? Is a totally reasonable question to ask as you start that project. Now we feel pretty good theologically about it, but even the question of are we bound to Earth is a question you can pause and wrestle with theologically. I'm trying to save lives, like how many things can I licitly do in pursuit of that goal? And is there anything I can do that in some ways doesn't respect the dignity of the person I'm trying to save? Is a question we have to ask repeatedly. It comes up a lot in end-of-life care, just like in beginning-of-life care, of how much support is or is ever obligatory, when are people free not to treat a disease, et cetera. So I think that question for IVF is not limited to IVF. It's always a question of, as we increase our ability to act in the world, we parallelly increase our duties to ask, are we acting rightly? Now here for Catholicism in particular, and this was notable to me as a convert, you know, Catholicism is always from the outside viewed as setting a lot of limits around sex. When can you do it? What is it for? Who can, who can't, when, how often, in what manner? But the thing that is also true is Catholicism just makes a much bigger claim about what sex is than almost any other faith. And those two things go together. You know, I had someone on Twitter saying, you know, sex is like rock climbing. It's fun. It's obviously a little dangerous, but like it's an exciting thing you can do recreationally. And someone replied like, look, if I could make children rock climbing, I'd obviously put a lot more thought into how I approached rock climbing. That real possibility that nothing else we do can do of giving rise to new life is part of what makes sex special, distinct, oriented towards marriage. And the attempts to kind of strip it of its meaning or spread out its purpose is destructive to marriage and to the genuine joy of it, that it's something more than mere physical pleasure. It's the possibility of engendering someone, even when you don't want to, is what makes it very different than every other fun physical thing you can do.
Okay,
Is there anyone else? I have another question here, but if you want one after, Anne-Marie. Okay, so there's a question here, and it's what? How would you respond to your children if they tell you they're going to use IVF? And I guess I would expand on that a little bit too. You know, I have friends whose children, especially their daughter, would come say, I need to have money to be able to give you grandchildren through IVF. And it's a dilemma for them. So what would you say?
You know, I certainly wouldn't pay for it. I certainly hope also that wouldn't be the first time we discuss the question, right? That my goal is to raise kids who will never come and say that to me, but to do it because they've had a big grounding in what sex means and what children are from the start. I think it's hard if it's kind of abstract and then it's coming up when you desperately want children. I'll talk to my kids throughout our lives as they get a little bigger about the children we've lost and what they meant to us. It's not something we've talked about that much yet at ages 5, 3, and 1. So we are kind of struggling with the question of at what point do we bring this up to them? They know about friends of ours who lost a child shortly after birth. So they know that children can be lost and that they are loved. And my goal is partly to have explicit conversations about IVF, but partly to really treasure both their brothers and sisters and the other endangered children we know or children our friends lose, so that ideally they have those particular people in mind and how much they are loved when they think about creating other people in this way. I can't guarantee, though, I said kids are about risk.
All right, if there are no other questions, I guess I'd like to close by saying...
one more.
There's one more, okay.
Thank you. I appreciate the discussion. We've been discussing, I think, we've been discussing IVF, but how about what the Catholic Church encourages? And I'm thinking more NAPRO technology and trying to figure out, I think it's one form of medicine where we just want to fix and have the child, as opposed to let's look at medically the husband and the wife and maybe what is wrong with the cycles or your uterus to make your body healthy and whole, giving you the opportunity then to bring life in.
Yeah, I really appreciate having this question to respond to, because right, we haven't touched on that much, though I know we've got some folks who can talk to it in even more detail in the back. And just for anyone who's not familiar, NAPRO technology is a suite of medical approaches that really puts a focus on what could be going wrong with your cycle, what could be being difficult in your body, endometriosis or anything else that's making it hard to conceive or hard to carry to term, versus IVF, often once you've had a number of miscarriages or a period without conceiving, we'll jump straight to IVF without kind of any investigation of, is there something here that could be fixed that would allow you to carry naturally? And my husband and I were grateful to get the help of a really wonderful NAPRO doctor throughout our period of miscarriages. And I know families who have children because they found something and were able to fix it. And I want to also be upfront, that's not my story. I had a really good doctor who ruled a lot of stuff out, but didn't find anything she could rule in that was fixable. We do have children, and we don't really know why. So I think that doctor helped us tremendously, even though she didn't ever find a root cause for us, though she did for other patients, in part because we had her prayers the whole time. So I think she did even more for us as a prayer than as a doctor. And that was a comfort to us throughout. She was the only doctor we ever had who wrote the names of every child we lost in her chart, rather than going like miscarriage 1, miscarriage 2, miscarriage 3. So I think NAPRO has a lot of potential to help some people and won't solve it for everyone. So there'll still be people who feel like, well, I've tried that. Now can I try IVF? But it's a really powerful thing, and it helps people with their health also, even when it can't help them carry to term.
All right. Well, I guess I'd say thanks so much, Leah. I think you'll be in the back
I'll be
here
in the
also
back.
to answer questions.